Okay, well, welcome students to the 2014 short-term study abroad. And one of the first things that we're going to do in this semester is we're experimenting this year. Typically, in a given year, we would have a series of classes sort of to bring you up to date on what we think are the most important things to learn before your trip to Europe. And students are obviously very busy. They have a lot of things going on. So one of the things that we've decided this particular year is to go ahead and try to do this online. So without further ado, today's lecture deals with the European Union. You may not be aware, but the nation of Spain became a part of the European Union really since its inception. And the thing about the EU, and that's how we'll refer to European Union, that you should know, is that it has really started from sort of very modest, very humble beginnings. So if you think about the United States, right, we're a collection of states. So you've got Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico, California, Florida, etc. Well, the EU, in similar fashion, is organized by member states. So you've got Spain, Italy, France, and other nations, UK, etc. So we'll get into all of that, but it didn't start out quite the same way as the United States did. So the United States were organized against sort of a common enemy, if you will, being King George in Europe, in England, right? Well, the European Union really got its start about more than 50, 60 years ago, shortly after World War II. And it really began to be organized around economic goals and objectives. Namely, European coal and steel communities wanted to get together. So if you really want to think back to how these member states were organized, you really have to go back to like 1952, 1957, and look at the different treaties that were in place in order to help regulate industry, improve commerce after World War II. This isn't a history class, but I'm sure everyone here understands that Europe was decimated. The economies of the European nations were decimated after World War II. I mean, yes, there were winners and losers, but really everyone lost because much of the infrastructure had been severely damaged, and most folks understood that it was going to take many, many years in order to be able to rebuild that. So the six founding states were Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. So those were the states that signed off on what's referred to as the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Community, right? And again, this is sort of the fun. This isn't the EU yet, but in these organizations, we see the seeds of the EU. And so what happens? Well, a number of different developments sort of take place. You begin not the European Union, but what's referred to as the European Community back in 1967 over things like the technologies that would be beneficial to everyone, like atomic energy, right? 1973, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Ireland all joined the European Community. In 81, Greece joins, and in 86, Spain and Portugal, Finland, Sweden, and Austria all joined in 95. So you can see that the European Community now has really, after 96, is really solidified. It's really taken place. It's really become something that is really now starting to take shape. So to continue to improve Europe's economy, the EC figures that, well, if steel and coal were something that we could help sort of regulate, I mean, we could probably regulate other things relating to trade and commerce. And it would be beneficial, right, if as part of this, we created one single market for the economic resources of Europe. In other words, so what would end up happening is, let's say that you wanted to sell a car, a French car, a Peugeot, for example, in Germany. Um, there would be a number of taxes, the import taxes, that one would have to pay in order to export the car from France and have it imported into Germany. So, this didn't seem to make a lot of sense, right? Because it was very protectionist, in the sense that each state was basically trying to preserve their jobs and whatnot. But at what the problem was is that you had nations like the United States that weren't similarly hampered, and then they could go in and sell their goods and services without taxation or very limited taxation, and so they would gain a competitive economic advantage. So, in order to sort of strike at that, the goals of the EC figured that one of our objectives should be to form a single market for Europe's economic resources. Uh, as these goals were accomplished, other goals were developed, like environmental movements, for example, things related to global warming and anything that environmental in scope, regulatory acts, human rights concerns, trafficking of persons, and things of that nature were also addressed. So the European Union, as we know it, really began in 1992 with the Treaty of Maastricht, and when it was ratified and basically rechartered the European community as the European Union. So what is the basis of the European Union? Well, we'd say that the European Union is based on the rule of law and democracy. It is neither a new state replacing existing ones, nor is it comparable to other international organizations. Its member states delegate sovereignty to common institutions representing the interest of the Union as a whole on questions of joint interest. All decisions and procedures are derived from the basic treaties ratified by the member states. So what you have here is a situation in which each of the member states are still sovereign. I mean, they still get to make decisions, based on their own self-interest, but in matters of which the collective have a mutual interest, right? Especially things like, in the days to come, we'll talk about things like, for example, cybersecurity, cybercrime. Obviously, they could all be victims of cybersecurity, cybercrime. In those instances, it makes a lot of sense to sort of attack the problem from a joint interest perspective, right? So that's really what the EU has begun now. This has become controversial a little bit, but we'll talk about that here in a little time. Okay, so what are the principal objects of the EU? Well, the first thing you would have to do, I mean, think about it, is establish European citizenship, right? If you're going to create a common market, you probably also need to create sort of a common denominator of citizenship. And one of the objectives, and you'll notice this right away when we land in Spain, there'll be one line for member states, EU. If you have a passport from one of the EU member states, and you can go get in that line, or if you have an EU passport, or you get all others, right? So that's where we fall in, and most of us will end up having to go into that line. So they create a European citizenship. So if you're a citizen of a member state, for example, if you're a citizen of Spain, you're also a citizen of the EU. And there's all sorts of grants, that grants all sorts of rights, privileges, and immunities. The other thing to keep in mind is that obviously one of the main reasons to organize is to ensure freedom, security, and justice. So there's no issues here of uh, member states not having a forum to, for example, decide disputes like trade disputes or personnel or human resource type disputes. And obviously promoting economic and social progress and asserting Europe's role in the world is also of great importance as well. Okay, so there's basically the EU is run by 5 institutions, each playing a specific role. First, you have the European Parliament. These are elected by the peoples of the member states. So think about it sort of as Congress, right? So each member state has an opportunity to vote for their representatives to the European Parliament. Um, the Council of the Union is composed of the governments of the member states, okay? So what ends up happening here is that rather than those folks getting elected, we might be familiar with terms like ex officio, right? So if you are, for example, if you are the mayor of San Antonio, you automatically sit on CPS board, right? Because CPS is wholly owned by the city of San Antonio. As an ex officio, the mayor, whoever the mayor is always also on the board. The Council of the Union is very similar to that. European Commission is the driving force and executive body. Court of Justice ensures that there's compliance with the law. I mean, think about it. So if there's a dispute between member states, for example, how would those disputes be resolved? So if you have, like a similar to a Supreme Court or something, so if, for example, the state of Texas and the state of New Mexico enter into some sort of a dispute, who mediates that dispute? Well, the one that mediates the dispute is the Supreme Court. Let's say, for example, that there's a water, a tributary or a river that runs through 2 member states, and one member state feels like too much water is being drawn out and that it leaves very little water for that member state. Well, they could obviously have that litigated and through the Court of Justice. And then the Court of Auditors has become increasingly more important because of the economic crisis after 2008. And it just ensures that there's sound and lawful management of the EU budget. So, European Parliament, as we said, is members elected every 5 years. Back in 2003, there were 625 members. Essential 3 functions: legislative, right, budget authority, and supervision of the Commission. If you want to learn more about that particular group, you can follow that link down there at the bottom. The Council of the EU is composed of the head of each member country. Typically those carry the name Prime Minister or President, and then the President of the EU Commission. We have one minister who acts as president. They're rotating twice yearly, 2 meetings a year in the president's country. So if Spain, for example, if he's the head of the or the president of the Council of the EU, the meetings would be held in that president's country. And it is the main decision-making body of the EU. It has responsibilities like legislative, budgetary. They want to ensure sound economic policies. And if there are any international agreements or treaties, this would be the one that would sign off on that. And again, I've left the link there for you so you can learn more about that. So the European Commission embodies and upholds the general interest of the Union. It has 20 members, 1 president, 2 vice presidents, and 17 commissioners. They're elected every 5 years by the member states. Okay, so the member states elect them after they've been approved by the European Parliament. So the European Parliament has some say. As the EU's executive body, it drafts legislation. It makes sure that treaties are being followed, along with the Court of Justice, which we mentioned in a second, and represents the EU internationally. So it manages the 15 EU agencies. And again, there's a link there for you if you'd like to learn more about that. So, the President of the EU, he's appointed, not elected, by the EU for a 5-year term and confirmed by Parliament. Right now, it's Herman Van Rompuy. He's the EU new president, former economics professor with a great deal of academic publications. Something that's very unusual here in the United States, but not too unusual in Europe to have academics actually serving in that capacity. So the president of the EU, if you want to learn more, there's also a link there. So the Court of Justice is 15 judges and 8 advocate generals appointed by member states for 6-year terms. Now, the Court of Justice ensures that community law is uniformly interpreted and effectively applied. It has jurisdiction in disputes involving member states, EU institutions, businesses, and individuals. And, maybe it's just me, but I find this to be the most interesting of all the EU institutions. Why? Well, because there's always a number of very interesting disputes that arise. For example, I don't know if any of you are soccer aficionados, but there's been a great deal of cases involving whether soccer players. A little bit of history. Okay, so you have several soccer leagues in Europe, right? So you have the Bundesliga in Germany, La Liga in Spain, and the Premier League, for example, in the UK, just to name a few examples. And it was up until the creation of the EU very uncommon, for example, for a Spanish player to play in the Bundesliga or the UK or the Premier League, right? They stayed in their own leagues because there was a lot of immigration regulations with them moving. So if you were a fantastic striker, striker is one of the ones that scores a lot of goals, you would probably play in you're from Spain, you'd probably play in Spain your whole life. Well, after the EU was created, and many of these players, and the other thing is that many of these leagues had regulations on how many foreigners could play on their team. For example, the Bundesliga, for many, the German professional soccer league, for many years had restrictions on how many foreign players you could have on a team. I think it was 2 or 3. So you had to be very judicious about what players you brought in and whatnot, because those guys are going to be the ones that they're basically your soccer players, and you couldn't bring in more than 2 or 3. Well, the Court of Justice is really the one that has sort of ripped all these rules apart and has really revolutionized, and I think, in the opinion of most people, made soccer more fun to watch anyway, because you do have a great deal of mobility amongst the better players in Europe. So that's just a quick example of sort of some of the disputes that the Court of Justice might be involved in. So where is the EU headquarters? Well, it's in Brussels, Belgium, selected as the headquarters of the EU because of its centralized location in Europe. You just need to get a map out and take a look at that. Enlargement. Well, in 2008, you had the economic crisis, and it has really put a major um, um, curtailing of talk about expanding. But it still sometimes, you know, rears its head. So that's still an issue. In fact, it's really not enlargement now. It's more like contraction. Greece, Portugal, Ireland are all, even Spain, are all in great sort of financial difficulty. And because the EU sort of is acting as insurer for some of these debts that they've encountered, they are now really wondering whether they can boot out certain countries that did not manage their financial affairs very well. And they're seriously thinking about possibly booting those folks out. Another issue is, of course, the euro itself. Now, we'll talk about the euro here in a little bit, but needless to say, some countries have been very reluctant to leave their, money, their currency behind. In fact, the UK did not. They still use the pound sterling in the UK. They don't use the euro, and they were permitted to do that. Multilingualism in official languages. So there's 20 official languages. This is since 2004 for 25 different countries. So obviously this can be quite chaotic, right? Openness, access, and transparency are important. How to get documents to the people. That is to say, how do they, involve themselves in civic engagement so that the member states and the citizens of the member states know what the EU is up to, what's happening, and keeping them informed. Obviously, safety and security is also an important concern. For example, in Spain, a country we'll visit, was a victim or a target of separatists from the north of Spain, factions, groups called ETA, that are basically calling for northern Spain to separate, Basque separatists. So, in other countries as well, the UK had some bombing issues a couple years back. So, for safety and security purposes, it's important that they share information and cooperate with one another in order to sort of attack terrorism from a number of different areas. So here are the latest arrivals. 10 or more countries become EU states by 2004. You have Cyprus, Malta, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia. You can see a map here of the 25 current EU countries. It gives you an idea of who's where and that sort of thing. Uh-oh, what happened? I think I went too far. Anyhow, and there's a list of the different nations there. Applicant countries include places like Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, but they're still pending because some countries basically said, "Look, you're a mess. I mean, you don't have your financial house in order, and as such, because you don't, it's going to create problems for you." And Norway has never been a member of the EU, but is partners with the EU for certain economic reasons. The economy's been historically very good, and they have no desire to merge with lesser economies. This is a major issue, right? Why would you pair up, let's say, with Greece that is drowning in debt and doesn't seem to can't find a way out. Well, they quite frankly they don't. But anyhow, we'll see. Switzerland, obviously, as you remember, Switzerland's always had a long history of being a neutral, but they are also not a member of the EU, but they partner again for economic reasons with the EU. And just to give you an example of how late Switzerland is to the party, they just joined the UN, the United Nations, in 2002. So the Swiss government wants Switzerland to join for economic reasons, but the Swiss people continue to vote against joining the EU. And it has to be something that's cooperative. The euro, well, first of all, there's a $1, or not $1, but €1 coin there on the screen. Yes, they use coins quite a bit, so be aware, don't over-tip thinking, I'll just leave a few of these coins on the table. Those coins are actually pretty, it's real money. So, okay, so the euro's new single currency represents the consolidation and culmination of European economic integration. Its introduction on January 1, 1999, marked the final phase of economic and monetary union, a three-stage process that was launched in 1990 as the EU member states prepared for the 1992 single market. Now, I can recall going to Spain and places like that where they had the currency in Spain used to be pesetas. And when they were transitioning from pesetas to euros, you would go to a market or whatever, and they'd have both prices. They'd have the pesetas price, and they'd have the euros price. Well, nowadays you can't find the pesetas price. Everything's in euros prices because that's the currency that they operate with. And anyhow, that is an important consideration, and the slow, gradual integration of this currency, of the euro. And so there's a $20 euro note there. Maybe some of you have already gotten your European, your EU notes, and you know what they look like. But you can see in the early 90s, with the idea of boosting cross-border business activity, the EU lifted restrictions of capital across internal EU borders. So the European Monetary Institute was also established in Frankfurt to pave the way for a European Central Bank. And then in '99, the euro was introduced as the single currency for 11 EU member states. Those are Austria, Belgium, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. Those are the ones that use it. So presently what we have, the euro and the previous national currencies were concurrently used in participating states. So from '99 to 2002, you could pay either with euros or with pesetas. But that has since ended. In 2002, the participating countries had their previous national currencies withdrawn permanently as legal tender, so they're no longer legal tender. And the EU member states not yet using the euro as currency: Denmark, Greece, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. So those are the states that have euros, but for whatever reason, that's not their official language. Okay, so what does it take to qualify for membership in the EU? Well, the first thing you'd have to have is achieve stability of institutions guaranteeing democracy, rule of law, human rights, and protection for minorities. So how would you go about proving that? Well, one of the ways that they do is having free and open elections, right? Looking at sort of police force and courts and even administration of justice in general. How is it all carried out? And then, of course, that there is protection for minorities as well. So those are all very important in determining whether someone qualifies or not. The candidate country must have the existence of the candidate country has the existence of a functioning market economy, as well as the capacity to cope with competitive pressure and market forces within the union. Basically, what this means is, do you have a thriving economy, an economy that's dynamic and can withstand sort of the usual economic business cycles without going broke, right? And this probably has turned out to be much more difficult than folks realize because of two things. One, when you give up, when you change your currency into a common currency, it means that you basically have given up the right toward to manipulate or to manage um, the ability, for lack of a better term, the ability to print money. You just can't print money like you used to. And many European countries for many, many years would make it out of financial hardships by printing money. So that's not really an option anymore. And so it's created problems for places like Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Greece, etc. So, three, the candidate country has the ability to take on the obligations of membership, including adherence to the aims of political, economic, and monetary union. This becomes, again, very difficult because, think about it, you're a politician that runs for office in Spain, right? So, Spain has its own problems. And now you're forced to think of sort of the EU, the European Union as a whole. And it is very possible that the goals of the EU might be incongruent with the immediate goals for Spain. So Spain may want lax monetary policy, for example. Let's say that they figure, look, we can get ourselves out of this mess by having the government spend money that it doesn't have, right? But that, so they'll sort of prime the pump a little bit and spend a great deal of money creating jobs and opportunities for people. Well, that is incongruent with having sound fiscal policy from the EU. The EU doesn't, that would not benefit the other member states. It would benefit your constituents, your nation, but it would probably have the opposite effect on other European Union countries. So it's really creating problems. And you see this manifesting itself in countries like Spain. Spain, you can read the climate that it is becoming anti EU, and in particular anti Germany, because Germany still is doing quite well financially and still. And as a result of that, they don't see the need to, try to create jobs or anything of the like. So what ends up happening? Well, you have many people that graduate university in Spain and go take jobs in Germany, because the economy in Spain is such that it's not really conducive to finding work. So the most valuable resource a nation has is its people. So in many ways, it's sort of undermining that. Okay, so what are some of the issues, more recent issues that other European countries have had to deal with? Again, the economic issue is a very important one. You have wealthy member states, right? In particular, Germany, that has, for all intents and purposes, been dictating monetary policy in the EU because they're the principal lender, right? So the principal lender gets to dictate sort of the terms of the agreement, and this hasn't sat well. So this has been sort of a primer on the EU and giving you some additional information that you might find useful before we actually leave Spain. We leave for Spain, and I hope you found it useful. And thank you very much for listening.